Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everyone for the warm welcome that we've received and for the great conversations that we've had. And especially I came onto this conference rather late when I found out about the project and the special workshop on the politics of location. I thought I have to get there regardless. At first I thought I'm just going to come and learn, and then was invited to present, so thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking about the Cuban Theater Digital Archive, which is a project that I started at the University of Miami. And the Theater Archive is an interactive, bilingual World Wide Web research site for Cuban theater and performing arts. It was developed in order to address the documentation challenges artists and scholars face vis-a-vis the writing of theater history that takes into account live performance. It is conceived as a research, teaching, and learning program that integrates classroom education and community engagement in Cuban theater, new media, and archival primary research with an online scholarly publishing effort that provides a unique view of contemporary Cuban culture. This cultural heritage initiative focuses in its initial phase on the works, both written texts and live art performance, of theater practitioners in Greater Cuba, that is, on the island and in the diaspora. And I use Greater Cuba to suggest that border zone in which citizenship is reformulated as a result of the encounter between competing national jurisdictions and the global economy. In this presentation, I will focus on the challenges diasporic literary archives present within the Cuban context and the space digital initiatives offer for bridging diasporic communities. So the CTDA First is managed as a digital humanities partnership between the University of Miami's College of Arts and Sciences and the libraries in cooperation with Cuba's National Council for the Performing Arts, and in Cuba also the Center for Stage Design Studies. As a community archive, it works closely with playwrights and theater artists, regardless of their place of residence, in order to document, preserve, and offer access collaboratively to playwrights and artist archives. And it's been funded in part by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And as I develop my presentation today, I'm going to just focus on kind of thinking about politics of location of 4 major coordinates. And the first coordinate that I need always need to talk about is U.S.-Cuba relations. So to situate our work on and with Cuba from Miami, one has to understand that in order to work with Cuba, one has to navigate 2 bureaucracies that are at odds with each other, actually that are enemies. The U.S. continues to characterize Cuba as a state that sponsors terrorism along with Iran, Sudan, and Libya. Cuba, on the other hand, believes that the U.S. continues to attack its revolution by supporting and sponsoring terrorist acts against Cuba since 1961 and by harboring terrorists on U.S. soil. As a result, you need a license from the U.S. Treasury Department to go to Cuba and to work with Cuba on anything. Cuban citizens, on the other hand, had not been allowed to travel to the U.S. until very recently, and now that they can travel, it is practically impossible for collaborative research projects to fund them. These sanctions are framed politically by an anachronistic relationship between Cuba and the U.S. that dates back to 1961, when Congress enacted the Foreign Assistance Act, imposing a total embargo on Cuba, including strict travel restrictions, even for scholarly purposes. This embargo was imposed in the midst of the Cold War, a confrontation between 2 irreconcilable ideological systems, which is supposed to have ended. However, the U.S. economic embargo towards Cuba and the continued policy of isolation towards the island is a relic of the Cold War that's still in our midst. Furthermore, a series of legal acts have been enacted after the Cold War has finished, and just a few: the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, the Cuban Liberty and Democracy Solidarity Act of 1996, the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba of 2004, and no comment, of course, on the titles of these acts. But they all continue. I mean, you have democracy, 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 but in the end, they all continue to restrict the rights of American citizens to travel to Cuba and impede the scholarly exchange of ideas. In the Miami-Havana border zone, a real and conceptual space in which acts of real and symbolic violence continue to be perpetrated, this complex political scenario is worsened because Miami in general, and the University of Miami in particular, tends to be associated with the politics of aggression, isolation, and disengagement characteristic of the older and more affluent sector of the Cuban exile community. The university houses the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies with a project that's called the Cuban Transition Project, which aims at studying and making recommendations for the reconstruction of a post-Castro Cuba. Established in 2002, this project has received generous grants from the U.S. Agency for International Development until, the last year was 2010. However, Cuban law prohibits citizens from cooperating with the U.S. democracy assistance activities and criminalizes those activities. The situation of Alan Gross, a U.S. international development professional imprisoned in Cuba while working as a U.S. subcontractor for a USAID program, is a case in point. So in the midst of this political and legal confrontation, we have been able to establish a cooperative, creative approach that builds on the informal partnership between the Cuban Theater Digital Archive, individual artists and scholars that are working on the island and off the island, as well as between the theater archive and several cultural institutions in Cuba. All of these contacts and collaborations have been informal and rely heavily on the personal trust we have built throughout the years as scholars and artists with great passion and sensitivity to the subject matter of theater, performance, and the archive, and archives in general. The second coordinate is the University of Miami Libraries Digital Initiatives. In spite of all of this kind of heavy-laden political situation with the University of Miami, the libraries is really an ideal place to develop this digital archive because it has focused its attention since 2000 in developing a digital program, and the development of the digital program actually has involved faculty members in its development. In 2000, it established a digital media laboratory with expertise in the conversion of analog, still, and moving images to digital formats. And one of the first projects was the Caribbean Writers Summer Institute archival video collection. This collection describes and video streams over 400 videotape presentations that were given at the Caribbean Writers Institute Summer Workshop held at the University of Miami from 1991 to 1996. And just as an aside, one of the comments today, I forget in which presentation, we said, no, I don't want my materials in any archive. Homer is my artist, my favorite. I'd like to be like Homer. I've actually, throughout the years, have about three specific artists playwrights who wanted their videos taken out. They didn't want their video streamed because it was like their first theater piece that they worked at this writers' workshop, and they didn't want people to have access to their first work. So question of what's in an archive and not, and what can video streamed is of interest here. In spring 2004, the library established a digital library faculty fellows program to assist faculty with projects that make a significant contribution to the teaching and practice of a particular discipline, and that provide access to traditional resources in a non-traditional way. The program offered an opportunity for librarians and archivists to work creatively with faculty members developing and using digital materials. And the theater archive, the Cuban Theater Archive, was one of the 4 projects that was selected. The library supplied $15,000 and 1 year development support which was for 2004-2005, and that included a multi-purpose designer-developer, metadata support, and the services of a digital media laboratory. So the very early platform and the early conception of the theater archive came out and was developed in this first year. The third coordinate, also at the library, is the Cuban Heritage Collection. The library houses the Cuban Heritage Collection, which is the most extensive collection of books, periodicals, and archival materials on Greater Cuba, outside of Cuba. It houses more than 70 collections containing materials related to diasporic literary archives. And a highlight of some of these collections gives us an idea of the variety and complexity of the terrain of diasporic literary archives in relation to Cuba. One of them, for example, is the papers of Gaston Baquero, who was a poet, essayist, and journalist. He was a member, along with Lezama Lima and Virgilio Piñera, of a group of intellectuals that took its name from the review Orígenes, which was an emblem of Cuban culture in the 1940s. He left Cuba in 1959 after the revolution, settled in Madrid, and was erased from the realm of literary culture in Cuba. As a matter of fact, like all of the artists that left Cuba between, the 60s and 70s lost their citizenship as well. So his work outside of Cuba did not gain notoriety until the late 80s. In Cuba, he began to be recognized again in 1994 when a conference of his poetry was held at the University of Havana, and his papers now reside at the collection at the University of Miami. Perhaps the most recognized and most well-known and visited collection at the CHC is the Lidia Cabrera collection. Lidia Cabrera was an ethnographer, a leading writer on Cuban folklore, and an internationally known chronicler of Afro-Cuban culture and religion. She spent 11 years in Paris, where she wrote her first collection of stories in Spanish. That collection of stories was translated into French and published first in French before it was published in Spanish by Gallimard as Conte Negro de Cuba. She eventually returned to Cuba, where she worked and published until her exile to the U.S. in 1960. Her work, and continued to work, primarily in Miami. Her work was also erased from literary culture in the island until the late 1990s. Another example is Fernando Ortiz, and this is a very small collection. It's 3 boxes, 3 linear feet. Fernando Ortiz was a Cuban lawyer, diplomat, social and economic historian, and a cultural anthropologist. He published in 1940 Cuban Counterpoint, Tobacco and Sugar, which is a socio-economic history of the sugar and tobacco industries in Cuba, and has been a cornerstone of Caribbean, especially of Caribbean history. He's the one who coined the term transculturation. Now, he never left Cuba. His papers are held at the Fernando Ortiz Foundation in Havana, and what the CHC holds is a very small collection related to his work on indigenous Cuban architecture, and it includes an original unpublished manuscript and typescript and handwritten notes towards this manuscript of unpublished manuscript on architecture. And I'm gonna, this is some notes on the bohío, the hutch houses, and on Indian, that he called Indian House. And I think one of my favorites here is, as he's thinking about indigenous architecture, he's trying to figure out whether the bohío, the houses, is it black architecture? Is the Indian housing, like, is there an example in Cuba of black architecture? And also, the notes, the ones that are handwritten notes, are written just in like cut up pieces of paper from receipts, from actually like bills, because he was a lawyer, so from bills of his firm, which you can see here, kind of the back of where his notes were written. And finally, from just a sample of the literary papers is the Dolores Pujadas Codina, She was a poet who left for Spain in 1935 at the young age of 18. And at the onset of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, she had to leave Spain and move to Italy, where she lived in Italy and grew up in Italy for a number of years, and eventually, returned to Cuba. She left Cuba in the early 60s to settle in Miami, where she was a very important member and founding member of the Academia Poética de Miami, the Miami Poets Society. Just actually, finally, they also have the papers of Gustavo Duran, who is a minor poet and novelist, and he actually donated the papers to the Cuban Heritage Collection, but the papers, and I'm going to quote from the finding aid, the papers are not the property of the University of Miami, but are being held in the Cuban Heritage Collection until such time as Cuba becomes a democratic nation again, when they will be deposited in the National Library of Cuba in Havana. And there are several collections that have some sort of version of this, that they're there temporarily. When I started working on the Digital Theater Archive, the library and the Cuban Heritage Collection held 3 collections pertaining to Cuban playwrights. And part of my idea in developing the Digital Theater Archive was, there are materials out there. These materials are not available to scholars, so at least let's digitize the materials and make these materials available. Now, what has happened is that throughout the years, right now, playwrights papers and theater artists and directors papers has become one of the strengths of the collection. So right now, in I guess like around 12 years, we have over 70 collections, and those includes the collections of major theater companies, so the papers of major theater companies. And I'm going to give you just a few examples also of the kind of playwrights papers that we hold. The first one is the papers of Eugenio Florit, which Florit was mentioned in the previous presentation. Florit was born in Salamanca, Spain, and then lived in Barcelona and Portbou, so moved from Spanish-speaking Spain to Catalonia. He then moved to Cuba in 1921, where he graduated from the University of Havana. He was also a lawyer. In 1940, he moved to the U.S., where he worked at the Cuban consulate first, and eventually went on to teach at Barnard, Columbia, and Middlebury. Throughout the 50s, he would go back and forth between the U.S. and Cuba, and his last trip to Cuba was in 1959. He lived in New York till 1982, and then moved to Miami, and now all of his papers that are at the University of Miami, this is a very, very large collection, which not only includes his work as a playwright, but as a theater critic, correspondence, photograph collection that are, it's a very interesting collection. We then have a number of playwrights, and I'm just using Hector Santiago as an example. So these are playwrights that left Cuba somewhere in the 70s or the early 80s. They were formed during the revolution, were very important young or emerging playwrights in the 1960s, but towards the end of the 60s, when Cuba had a strong persecution of homosexuals, these were playwrights that were persecuted. Some of them went to, quote-unquote, internment camps for rehabilitation, etc. And Hector Santiago is one of them. He was, an important playwright throughout the 60s, went into one of these camps, became a persona non grata in Cuba, and he left Cuba for Spain in the late 70s and left in Cuba all of his works. His plays were buried at a friend's house, and eventually the plays were came out of Cuba through kind of diplomatic mail via France, eventually made it to him in New York. He in the States, did most of his work and continues to create in New York. And as we developed the theater archive, the papers then eventually made it to Miami. We have several collections of that nature. We also have the collection of people like Manuel Martin Jr., who is a playwright who actually left Cuba not for any political reasons in the early 50s. We have several of those who left in the 50s or 60s for, they wanted to come to the States to work, to study, but not for political reasons. And Manuel Martin Jr., for example, he wrote most of his work in Spanish, some of it in English. He's a very, very important figure in the off-of-Broadway movement in New York in the 60s. And I actually wrote one of the earliest scholarly pieces on his theater and had worked with him and other playwrights in New York in developing a directory of Cuban and of Latino playwrights in the early 90s. And throughout, our connections and work, then eventually when the theater archive got established, then the materials, also the physical materials, are now in the physical collection at the Cuban Heritage Collection. And we have then also another set of writers. These are writers who left Cuba when they were young, who grew up in the States, who write primarily in English and have, like Caridad Svich, and who have been trained in New York. All of their, trained in the States. All of their work is in English, but identify themselves either as Cuban Americans or as Latino writers or Cuban descent, but whose work is in English. And I've never asked them, but I would venture to say that, although they consider themselves as diasporic writers, I don't know that they would think that the place or the location for the materials would be Cuba. And I'm thinking of the question that was raised about the Trinidad emigre in New York. I don't know that specific situation, but sometimes, like some of these diasporic writers or quote-unquote hyphenated writers, we have to think about what should be the place for their archives. And finally, we have also a number of materials that are really like digital materials only. They're not born digital, but have been digitized, of playwrights like Salvador Lemis. And these are primarily playwrights that left Cuba after the 90s, and they've been able to, they now hold kind of double citizenship. So Lemis is Cuban Mexican. We have several that are Cuban Spain, others that are like Cuban and French. And so Salvador Lemis, for example, and I have just a few of his primary bibliography, all of his plays are on PDF in the theater archive. Some are published, some are unpublished, but they're available there. And then finally, we also have, like I said, a number of important, the papers of important theater companies. And of course, within the theater companies, we have a wealth of first version of scripts and the version of the play for specific productions. And for a theater scholar, that's also very interesting, like what happens or what are the changes between the published piece and then the piece that gets staged. And so since the Cuban Theater Digital Archive tends to approach culture not only as something that we inherit, but also as something that we create and experience, it invites community participation. Thus, as I've been suggesting, we invite individual artists and theater companies, acknowledging that by collecting, preserving, and making accessible documents, photographs, oral histories, and many other materials, which document the histories of particular groups and localities, community archives and heritage initiatives make an invaluable contribution to the preservation of a more inclusive and diverse local and national heritage. And I should add, and it's a national heritage that needs to be, I think, rethought more and more from it. So a national and kind of transnational locales. We expect contributions of other unique collections of either previously digitized or born digital images which may not meet technical archiving standards. And I mean, I have a section in this I won't read, but when and for those of you that are librarians and archivists and work in digital collections, you know that there's set archiving standards for digital materials. A lot of times, I mean, the materials that we get, especially from Cuba, don't meet those standards. But I mean, I've been able to work with the library in convincing them that even if they don't have the 600 DPI, etc., that's required, that these are materials that otherwise would not be available. So we've been able to include them. Also, as I've been suggesting as well, in working with Cuba, we maintain complete transparency of our motives and institutional affiliations. For the literary and archival materials from Cuba, when theater artists approach me, I always direct them to our two institutional collaborators in Cuba, places where it is guaranteed that their materials will be safeguarded. And I say guaranteed because oftentimes, as we've been discussing, sometimes the materials get to a national archive, so it's kind of a safe place, and somehow either the materials get lost or, unfortunately, I mean, in the case of Cuba, like oftentimes an artist dies, and supposedly their materials are going to, like X place, which is not either one of these two, and in about a month the materials are, being sold on eBay, or, I mean, they come to me in Miami saying, I have this from, this playwright, would you want to buy them? And one finds, oneself in this very uncomfortable situation of saying it's not our place to buy this material. It should really go back to Cuba where the rest of the material is. But for those group of artists, what we do is get the materials to these two institutions, and then we do work very hard to try to get their materials scanned so that they can be made more accessible through the archive. And it is our hope, of course, that when the internet situation improves in Cuba, the digitized materials from Cuba can reside in the Cuban servers, and then CTDA would simply point to them. We wouldn't necessarily host them. We have a server that it's a .org server and not a .miami edu server, but the servers are, in the backbone of the library. So this quick sampling of selected materials of Cuban playwrights anchored in the macropolitics of U.S.-Cuba relations in general, and Miami-Cuba relations in particular, gives us an idea of the complexity of the politics of location when dealing with diasporic literary archives by Cuban playwrights. Although theoretically all of these materials, could be or would be considered diasporic archives, some of the writers and some of the playwrights that I've been discussing do not self-identify as diasporic artists. So some of them identify themselves as Cuban artists in exile. Others, like the hyphenated artists, define themselves as American, U.S. American writers of Cuban descent or Latino writers of Cuban descent. And then, of course, you have all of those who are, think that they're, Cuban writers, but, their materials might be elsewhere. But overall, playwrights and other artists, want to have their materials included in the archive because, as Lemis, the Cuban-Mexican playwright, has stated, and I quote, he says that the archives make sure, and I quote, that things do not get lost in the shipwreck of our condition. I think it's a beautiful and moving phrase. As a community cultural heritage initiative, to conclude, the archive is part of a visual culture that lives beyond cyberspace and allows communication and exchange between two communities that are politically separated. Like other virtual communities, our constructed communities live within and around the relationships we form by moving within an electronic space that connects us with others. Virtual cultures extend rather than exclude our physical contact with each other. Despite the challenge of U.S.-Cuba relations in general and of Cuba-Miami in particular, we continue to develop ties and collaborations on intellectual, artistic, as well as technical levels with partners in Cuba. The Theater Archive, in its goal of preserving and providing access to evanescent performance materials and to literary playwrights materials, while fostering scholarly communication between different communities, will continue to push the boundaries of what is possible at this time of potentially changing attitudes in U.S.-Cuba relations. The archive is creating virtual communities in which cooperation, mutual understanding, and common artistic and intellectual goals brings us together outside of the Cold War rhetoric that continues to guide U.S.-Cuba relations on both sides of the Florida Straits. Through this process, the archive might even find itself in a position to serve as a model to other digital initiatives exploring U.S.-Cuba collaborations. Thank you.